Well, it's Memorial Day weekend once again, and today and tomorrow people are going to be gathering in cemeteries and at war memorials, some of them which look like this. One of the things they all seem to have in common are these plaques that contain these unfortunately very long lists of people's names, and each year those lists seem to grow longer. So in light of that unfortunate truth, I think it's appropriate on Memorial Day weekend to reflect on the possible. Even as we honor and thank and remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice, maybe we could also reflect on what we might be able to do in order to stop that list from growing on future Memorial Days. I was sitting with that thought a few years ago during the week leading up to Memorial Day, and what came up for me was something that President Dwight D. Eisenhower said all the way back in 1961. That was at the end of his presidency, and he gave a speech to the nation. It was called his farewell address, and in it he said some what turned out to be prophetic things about war and peace. Just as a refresher, Ike, as he was known, I still have a button that somebody gave me, I like Ike. I was born in 1957, so I wasn't quite in the midst of the campaign, but we have that button sitting around somewhere. He was a 5-star general, and he had the title of Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces in Europe. So this is the guy who commanded really what was the greatest military mobilization in the history of the world. And he's the one who gave the order to commence the Normandy invasion on June 6th in 1944. And in the grand scheme of things, not just 20/20 hindsight, but it was pretty clear even at the time that it was necessary and even essential to do what had to be done to displace what is only rightly called the monstrous evil of Nazi Germany. And yet, General Eisenhower never let his judgment become clouded by the enormous power that he wielded, and he never lost sight of the very heavy weight of responsibility for the lives lost. So, here's what he had to say about war and peace. 1961, just 8 years before he died. He said, "A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals so that security and liberty may prosper together." Let that sink in for a few seconds. Prophetic. One of the key ideas in there that I even emphasized is this concept of having an alert and knowledgeable citizenry. I hear some chuckles. I hear some chuckles.
Laugh right out.
That's good because the next thing I was about to say is, so how's that been working out for us lately? Are we knowledgeable and alert, or are we distracted and asleep? Well, the media seems to want to drive us to distraction rather than help to keep us knowledgeable, because for every solid story that's based on facts, objectivity, and solid logical reasoning, for every story like that, there's a dozen more about, oh, I don't know, the Kardashians, or dancing stars and American Idols, the latest reality show where, I don't know, it's, the latest Hollywood divorce or sports scandal and so on and so forth. The stuff that could help us to get knowledgeable gets lost. We don't get facts, we get talking points, we get ideology masquerading as evidence. And so, instead of being alert or awake, the goal here seems to keep us distracted. And as long as that keeps going on, we're going to have more and more of our young people put in harm's way and adding to the names on the lists at the war memorials around the world. And we can only hope that that wasn't done to feed the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about. So I know in Unity, we're all about positive thinking. I try to avoid pessimism, but there are times when I look at our larger culture and I'm increasingly convinced that there are powers at work that do not want an alert and knowledgeable citizenry. The reason that I don't become pessimistic or more cynical than I already am is the reason I don't become pessimistic is because everything we need to become alert and knowledgeable, it's freely available. It's freely available. It's no secret. Nothing is hidden. Books aren't being banned or burned. The great ideas of history are available in every library, in every town, and now on the internet. I think it's a great tragedy that soldiers died to protect our freedom, and of course I think one of the most important freedoms among the many that they died to protect is our freedom to think for ourselves. They died to protect that freedom, and we fail to exercise it through omission, through being distracted, whatever. And the only barrier to that is self-imposed. The only barrier is this idea that we're somehow not capable of thinking for ourselves, that we need to be given the answers, we need to be given some kind of a pre-packaged ideology. Which is why here for the month of May, and a lot of the times here at Unity of Auburn, we try to talk about some of these new ideas, things that can help us to be alert and knowledgeable. Recently we've been working with this book called Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society by Nicholas A. Christakis. This is something that we need to know about. This is something that we need to study. This is something that we need to be able to appreciate, because his argument is that human beings are genetically inclined towards creating a society that is more compassionate, peaceful, knowledgeable, and alert. The horrors and atrocities of war are not our inevitable future. It's just the opposite. The author says that there are two timeless truths. There's more that unites us than divides us, and society is basically good. Here's how he puts it. He says, human nature contains much that is admirable, including the capacity for love, friendship, cooperation, learning, all of which allows us to form good societies and fosters understanding among people everywhere. And I would say that a major element of any society that we're going to call good is that it has that alert and knowledgeable citizenry. When we lose sight of what's admirable, or maybe I should say what's true and beautiful about humankind, that's when we become susceptible to the lies and the manipulation that so often lead us into wars. We cease to be alert and knowledgeable citizens, which is why we need to actively engage these ideas and help get the word out as best we can. So last week, we talked about some of the good things that we have going for us, a list of attributes that can be found in cultures all around the world that are part of that blueprint which leads us to form good societies. We talked about 6 of them last week. Valuing individuality, love and empathy for kin, friendship with those beyond kinship, social networks, cooperation, and education, the free exchange of ideas. So there's 2 more that we need to add to that list, and these 2 tend to be a bit more of a paradox, kind of a double-edged sword. The next 2 are preference for one's group and hierarchy. Now the author contends that these are natural and essential attributes of that list of things that help us to create a good society, despite the fact that they can be problematic. Which to me means that they simply require some special attention. And I think that Dr. Christakis would agree. This is from the preface to the book, where he says, "As I write, the United States seems riven by polarities, right and left, urban and rural, religious and a-religious, insiders and outsiders, haves and have-nots. Analyses reveal that both political polarization and economic inequality are at century-long peaks." And he goes on to say that one of the most dispiriting questions I have encountered in my own laboratory research is whether the affinity people have for their own groups, whether those groups are defined by some attribute like nationality, ethnicity, or religion, or by social connection, friends or teammates, must necessarily be coupled with wariness or rejection of others. Can you love your own group without hating everyone else? That's the problem. And I'll go ahead and answer that last question. Can you love your own group without hating everyone else? Of course. Of course we can. Yeah, the existence of groups, having a preference for a particular group, doesn't automatically lead to that kind of polarity and tribalism. Social hierarchies aren't automatically oppressive or don't automatically lead to exploitation. Those things happen when we're asleep, when we're not alert, when we're not knowledgeable, when we don't engage in critical thinking. Those things don't happen where we have an alert and knowledgeable citizenry. So group affinity, forms of hierarchies all work perfectly fine in that context. You know, we're just starting to see that tribalism is a phase that individuals and cultures go through all around the world, throughout history. Think about it. It's absolutely essential for our survival that we bond initially with our family and our kin groups. And it only becomes a problem when it stops there. When that boundary becomes set in stone, so to speak, instead of becoming more permeable, where we can reach out and extend some of that same affinity to people outside the group. Sometimes in order to avoid getting stuck there without creating that impermeable wall, sometimes what we have to do is give it a little nudge. And maybe the best way to do that, and this is something he suggests in the book, one of the best ways to begin to expand our circle of caring and compassion out beyond these arbitrary group boundaries is to intentionally shift our perspective. In the book he says, what you see depends on where you stand. We need to change our position from time to time. I like to think of it in terms of traveling up to Lake Tahoe, like many of us will be doing here in a couple of weeks for our retreat. Karen and I, of course, start out where we live in Rockland. We like to take I-80, so at one point as we're going down 65 to get on I-80, you can see the snow-capped mountains out there, basically filling your horizon on a clear day. It's an awe-inspiring and beautiful sight. And then, ironically, the closer you get to it, the faster it disappears. And as you actually reach the very mountains that you were just looking at and start climbing up them, it becomes something completely different. A second perspective, still beautiful, but very different. And then later, again, on the same mountains you were just looking at, when you're at the summit or the pass level, you're actually among the peaks that you were looking at from the very start, but they don't look like they're, I don't know, whatever, 7,000 feet tall, like they did from the valley. When you're up there among them, they're just these huge hills surrounding you all over the place, these jagged, rocky hills. A completely different perspective. Again, awesome and beautiful. It's the same darn thing. And yet, which version is the truth? Which perspective is the real, the one, the only true Sierra Nevada mountain range? Well, you know, they say there's no such thing as a dumb question. If you've ever taken that trip and experienced these three multiple perspectives, well, I think you'd probably agree with me that that's a really dumb question. Which one is real? All of them. Each one part of the entire picture, but you wouldn't know that if you hadn't experienced the shift in perspective. If you never left the valley, you'd think one perspective was all there is. If you lived in the foothills, yet another. If you live up at the pass level, yet a third one. So imagine going through life, vigorously defending your narrow little perspective as the one and only true version of things. It's exhausting, it's dangerous, and yet human beings do that. And then we gather into little groups where we try to get a bunch of people together who agree with us. And then we proceed to try to defend the truth of that perspective from the other two or any other perspective. Exhausting, dangerous. All it takes is some willingness to acknowledge that another perspective exists, at the very least. Maybe even do something to put ourselves in a position to take that other perspective. Now, there's two ways to do that. One I'm going to call the Mark Twain way. Mark Twain, who said this: "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts." Get up and move. Physically move and get a different perspective. That's one way. We can actually go there, travel up the mountain, take the journey, but that may not always be possible due to whatever, time constraints and other factors. So, here's another suggestion. We're going to call this the Marcel Proust way, who said, "The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes." That's another way to do it. That's another way to do it. At the very least, we can educate ourselves about other perspectives. We can learn about other cultures and customs with open eyes and open minds. Either way, the Twain way or the Proust way, the ability to take and appreciate multiple perspectives, that's something that we're just recently learning about, fairly recently in our long evolutionary history. And we still have to consciously work on it in order to overcome tribalism, which is where the alert part comes in. We can't be asleep, we can't be complacent. It's something that we have to make the effort to practice. So that's one of the ways to deal with our tendency to get stuck in a tribal perspective. I haven't even touched on equality and hierarchies yet, which means that that'll be one of the topics that we'll jump into next week when we're going to wrap up this series. So I hope to see you then. Thank you.